au pied levé, comme on dit chez nous. Paul va nous proposer une recherche très féconde sur Prince Hall. Alors, sa communication a été faite c'est une recherche faite avec Brent Morris, et le grand intérêt de cette communication, c'est certes le sujet, Prince Hall, qui intéresse notamment certaines personnes de l'assistance, mais aussi la méthode mise en œuvre, puisqu'ils ont fait quelque chose d'extraordinaire, qui est d'utiliser les énormes corpus qui ont été numérisés pour faire des recherches en scannant ces corpus numérisés et en trouvant à la fin du XVIIIe et au début du XIXe siècle beaucoup d'éléments dans la presse américaine sur le personnage de Prince Hall, la maçonnerie de Prince Hall. Et c'est donc une étude qui permet de voir l'image, d'abord ambiguë, puis finalement positive, de Prince Hall aux États-Unis à la fin de sa vie et au début du XIXe siècle. So, I don't know if it's okay for the translation now. I suppose to.
Yeah.
Paul?
And we all hope that Dr. Bernheim is feeling better with greatly advanced age come problems, and we're hoping that he will mend and be back among the ambulatory and be able to attend things again. He sends his sympathy and regrets, and we do to him. We are honoring him with the award for lifetime achievement, and we will certainly see that it goes to him with suitable ceremony.
We will just check if its translation works.
Yes.
Alors, on me fait signe que la traduction n'est pas encore en cours. Non? Est-ce que vous avez la traduction là, non? Elle est en train de s'installer, ok. So the translator is
All set.
5 minutes. Well,
Oh,
3 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. How is it doing in general? The sessions are going?
Yes, everything is going well, except this translation issue, but you know, the translation issue was a problem for the first sessions, but for the second, it was in French, and you had a conference in English, so everybody could have
Yeah,
referred to now it's with translation. Super.
It's all set?
It's okay.
Okay. What you're going to hear is some unique and new things about 18th century Freemasonry that I'm sharing with you in cooperation with my colleague and friend Brent Morris. I will say two things at the beginning. One is these discoveries are the fruit of the internet, and they are possible because of what has happened in scholarship and research because of the digitalization of old records. They could not have been accomplished 20 years ago. I have been a beneficiary of the internet, even though, like I'm sure some of you, I find it at times necessary to find someone who is 12 or 15 years old to enable me to use the computer. At the Edinburgh Conference a few years ago, I presented evidence that the very famous poem, The Master's Apron, which is recited in all Scottish lodges, was actually not by Robert Burns, because I located the poem in an obscure publication by someone else. Recently, I published a collection of Albert Pike's poems, and lightning struck twice, and I discovered that his famous poem, The Old Canoe, was not written by him. In fact, he later on said it wasn't written by him. So I've had occasion to see how your work and mind can be changed by the internet. How the following discoveries took place occurs tangentially because of buying a newspaper. American booksellers often sell single copies of newspapers. And when they do, they highlight one article. So I saw a colonial newspaper of 1787 advertised because it had a letter in it by George Washington in which he was resigning as President General of the Order of the Cincinnati, but assuring people that he would continue with his other duties as patriot and politician. So, because it involved an order that is controversial in America, the Cincinnati is a hereditary order of French and Americans who are the descendants of officers in the American Revolution. I bought the paper. When I got the paper, it of course had the letter in it by General Washington. But on another page, there was a poem. And I was so surprised to see this poem that I called Brent Morris. And he was so surprised, he rushed over to my office to see this poem from the 18th century. That is a little prelude to these discoveries. The other point I would make in beginning is that we as antiquarians, historians, scholars do have an influence on what happens out in the wider world. In America, in every city and town which has a traditionally African American portion where the institutions, social institutions, shops and stores are mostly frequented by people of color, there is a Masonic Lodge. I can't think of any sizable black or African community in America that does not have a Masonic Lodge. The one behind me is one that happens to be in Birmingham, Alabama, but there are hundreds and hundreds of them. They are not perhaps as fancy as other Masonic temples, but they are almost invariably and always the community centers, and they have played a part in the struggle of people of color in America for their rights. They are, of course, Prince Hall Masonic temples. They were not built by people of great means. They were built by people who put little jars on the counters of their stores to get donations. They are not temples like you see in the Masonic order in some cities. They're usually very practical buildings like you see here, and they house many activities of the black community. Blood bank drives. Sometimes they have a little library because there were no library resources in the black community. They often have classes for tutoring students. all very praiseworthy and certainly a credit to Masonry, but not to white Masonry. They derive part of their success from the claims of African American or black Freemasons in America to legitimacy, to authenticity, because they claim to trace their beginnings to an incident in Boston in the 1700s involving the Duke of Cumberland and the modern Grand Lodge, before, you will recall, the ancients and the moderns came together. They make very much of their rights and their legitimacy, and they turn to history repeatedly for this authenticity. In the 19th century, after a period where they were accepted as the problem of race in America became graver, their historical claims were challenged. In particular, in the 1870s, a African American named Lewis Hayden, Hayden, campaigned to prove the legitimacy of their 18th century claims. He wrote a book, Masonry Among Colored Men, and the issue became sharply divided, with a majority of white Masons denying the claims of these African Americans and their lodges. Huge literature, big literature was created, and the discussion of African American Freemasonry centered around the incidents I will tell you about today, some of which have not been discussed before, but were there, you might say, for all to see, because they were in the colonial newspapers. Now you see the connection that once I saw this poem, which I'm going to tell you about, I realized that we now had the ability to search electronically the colonial press. You did not have to go through these newspapers one by one. You could find material in them electronically. Now, invariably, this discussion centers around an individual named Prince Hall and his adventures with a military lodge, the 38th Athlon, which today exists, still exists, as a regiment, though not as a lodge, as part of the Mercian Regiment in the United Kingdom. The story told was that Prince Hall, a man of Boston, was befriended by the members of this military lodge, which, of course, was stationed in Boston during the British Empire's occupation. And he and some of his friends were made Masons. And they then petitioned the modern Grand Lodge for a charter, and that charter was granted with many privileges. and that is the origin of black Freemasonry. We could look at the second picture. The Prince Hall movement is one of the few Masonic movements today that maintains an abundance of regimental lodges. It has lodges at numerous American military bases. Regimental or military lodges have largely disappeared. There are a few left, but most of them in the United Kingdom are gone. But at the time, in the 1780s, that the British were occupying Boston, regimental lodges were much more frequent. The initiations and the subsequent social life crises and events are in these newspapers. So one can immediately say that the accusation that the thing is just a story is simply not true. The newspapers confirm an active, very active, African-American Masonic life in colonial America, as we shall see. At this conference, Professor Summers is presenting news which has circulated rapidly throughout the Masonic world, that the meeting of 1717 at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in London to organize the first Grand Lodge was fictitious. And it seems to me that Professor Andrew Prescott and Professor Summers sustained that argument. So, curiously, at this conference, I am here, and Dr. Morris spiritually is with me. I am here to say that the Prince Hall story is true and can be proved. And Professor Summers tomorrow will say that Dr. Anderson's story is false and present not speculation, but empirical evidence. You too can do this because we have services now like RedX, Newsbank, Genealogical Bank, flood of these, where you can search papers to your heart's delight and find things that even 1,000 years would not have enabled you to find if you had to read all those newspapers looking. Now, what emerges is not only that these events happened, but other peripheral evidence in support. For example, how is it that a black gentleman in Boston would know soldiers? Well, I say here for the first time publicly, for the curious reason that he worked in leather. He made shoes and made leather things, harnesses, and he made drum heads, which we didn't know, and he sold them to the Army. And we have a receipt you'll see today for 5 drum heads sold to the Army. Well, how many people in the small town of Boston, about 19,000 people then, made drum heads? And if you were there in the military, I have to find out a lot more about drum heads. But I presume, like shoes, they wear out. And so you went to Prince Hall, thank God, that he could make a military drum. It's a little bit of information, but it goes, as you see, towards helping us explain all of this. It also shows a tolerance of white and black people in Masonry that was to diminish and fade. Albert Pike, who was somewhat deified in Scottish Rite Masonry in America, is quoted as saying, "When I have to accept Negroes as brothers or leave Masonry, I shall leave it." Such was the feeling that developed. But the key word is develop. As we shall see, that was not always the case. It developed later, and those of you who know a bit of history know that in the period after the Civil War, the American Negro was almost, in some places, in a worse place than he or she were before the Civil War, in the period we call Reconstruction. The earliest known newspaper reference to all of this is 7 years after Prince Hall and his friends were initiated by the British Regiment. And my account today stops in 1827, the year that the African Lodge, as chartered by the modern Grand Lodge, declared its independence. Now, when we look at this, we have many directions in which we could go. We could investigate regimental history. We could certainly investigate more the commerce of Boston. And we could investigate, alas, the slave ships, which will play a part today. At any rate, our discoveries produced a very curious thing. It is December 1782, and the following appears in the Independent Ledger, which is a Boston newspaper. On Friday last, the feast of St. John the Evangelist was celebrated by St. Black's Lodge of free and accepted Masons, who went in procession, preceded by a band of music, dressed in their aprons and jewels. Well, a little sarcastic, because the African Lodge was simply called, on the rolls of the modern Grand Lodge, the African Lodge. It was not called St. Black's. A letter appears next week, January 9th, 1783, and it's signed by Prince Hall, the master of the African Lodge. And he says, thanks for mentioning us, but we're not called St. Black's. Of course, the writer was being sarcastic to call them St. Black's. And we do not aspire about high titles. We humbly conceive that the pillars of Masonry are love to God and love to all mankind. We did not have a splendid entertainment that they described. We had an agreeable one. And with humble submission, I am your humble servant. So we began to see this black gentleman in Boston writing to the press and getting published, putting the case for various things. So then we began to see these things in the newspapers. Meanwhile, back in London, the bureaucracy of the Grand Lodge has failed to get the charter sent to Prince Hall. So some people in Boston are saying, you have a charter, let's see it. And in 1784, the newspaper had a little fun with the lodge. They put in a notice, 6 shillings reward. Lost the charter of a certain Grand Lodge. Any person that has found the same and will leave it with the printers shall be entitled to the above reward. Well, Prince Hall must have been very agitated. He knew he had a charter, but he didn't have physical possession of it. He was regularly holding meetings and, moreover, paying his yearly dues and assessment to London. They seemed able to receive his money, but not to send the charter. Well, he wrote several times, and finally, in the paper, there was a big fuss because a member of his lodge named Luke Belcher died, and he was the slave and then the free man of Jonathan Belcher, the governor of New Hampshire, the governor of Massachusetts, the governor of New Jersey, and then the founder of Princeton University. And like many black people at the time, Mr. Belcher, Brother Belcher, took the name of his master. But he himself was somewhat distinguished. And so there was a long obituary, very long obituary, mentioning his involvement in Masonry and the elaborate funeral service that was conducted for him. And in this obituary, his merits, not his color, is mentioned at length. And the writer of this obituary says, may you all live within the compass that he lived. And this should be taken to heart, not even to those superficially distinguished by nature, unfortunately having perhaps little else to boast of than a different complexion. Those are strong words. If you think that our description of his funeral is too much, well, he did many good things. And if you criticize this, and you are superficially, in the author's words, distinguished by nature, unfortunately perhaps having little else to boast of than a different complexion. So we began to get a sense of discussion, certainly of recognition of black Freemasonry, but that didn't help Prince Hall. So he must have been very relieved when in 1787 May, the newspaper reported on the front page, African Lodge by Captain Scott from London comes the charter, which His Royal Highness the Duke of Cumberland and the Grand Lodge of Great Britain have been graciously pleased to grant to the African Lodge in Boston. Certainly, silence the critics. Now we come to the poem that I discovered and excited Brent Morris and me. There is, of course, a notice of this charter in other colonial papers, so the news was fairly widespread. And someone, just a week later, wrote a poem, and that was put in the page of the paper with Washington's letter. The poem is entitled Masonry. Throughout the globe's extensive round, the fire of love extends, which glows in true maverick hearts, that family of friends. Even Africa's sons, ill-fated race, now feel its genial heart. With chartered rights from England's Duke, the lodges meet. No more shall colors disagree, but hearts with hands unite. For in the wondrous mystery, there's neither black nor white. And lest a bleached brother, white brother, should in scorn turn up his nose, know, and look for this cleverness, know that a prince may favors take from dukes, nor honor lose. Know that a prince, Prince Hall, may favors take from dukes, nor honor lose. Well, this is a most extraordinary discovery, and it was noticed in the literary history of African Americans published by Harvard, but not in the Masonic Conversations. If we could have the next slide, please. This is Boston at the time of Prince Hall. And it was a very small town. The British governor and residents were very, very much in keeping. The Masonic evenings of my own lodge, St. John's Lodge, which is the oldest surviving lodge in the Western Hemisphere, 1733, were held in the King's Chapel, which still exists, royal pew and all. It was a royal British city. And the fact that the Duke of Cumberland had recognized Prince Hall had a great deal of meaning. I think one then must think a little bit about Prince Hall. He was not a slave ever. He was a free man. And there were a number of people in Boston who had never been slaves. They were free people. They were not in slavery. And in addition to that, he was a civic-minded person, and he took part in the school system, in the library, and many things, and he was outspoken, and he was a good writer. In the next year, history played into his hands. He must have thought when the incident I will relate to you occurred that it was a great misfortune. But it did not turn out to be a great misfortune. The year after he received his charter from the African Lodge, some blacks in Boston were kidnapped by one of the slave ships. Could we have the next slide, please? Here is Prince Hall in a contemporary portrait. And he was not anybody's slave, nor were some of these other notable African Americans. However, they ran the risk, they always ran the risk of kidnapping and of enslavement. There were over 500,000 slaves then in the American colonies. It was an enormous business, and the slavers shamelessly would kidnap free Negroes in order to sell them. So in Boston, in 1788, several blacks who were not slaves were kidnapped by a slaver, and one of these men was a member, a Freemason, of African Lodge. Immediately, Prince Hall went to work. He petitioned, he protested, he led all kinds of activity, but it looked fairly hopeless. They had been taken and were going down to the Caribbean, and it became a cause célèbre because of Prince Hall, because of his agitation. And of course, he was master of the lodge, and one of his brothers had been kidnapped into slavery. It appeared in much of the colonial press. The man who ran the slave ship, Ruby, was an evil man named Solomon Babson. And he cleared out as soon as he could fill up his ship. And he very often had lost slaves coming from Africa. And so to fulfill his contract, he would kidnap black people in America so he would have a full consignment. Could we have the next slide, please? Now, of course, Prince Hall was protected in this agitation. He was not, quote, put in his place. And here is some evidence of his sales of drumheads. We all know how the military are fond of their bands, and especially their drums. We now know that he made these heads and sold them. This is a receipt for 5 of them. So he could raise this terrible stir, whereas a simpler person obviously less connected, would not. He petitioned the government, the royal governor, and I read from Prince Hall's own petition that your petitioners are justly alarmed at the inhuman and cruel treatment that our brethren, free citizens of the town of Boston, lately received. But in all truth, once one was placed into the slave market, and this market, the big one was at St. Bartholomew's in the West Indies, all was lost. And then a most extraordinary thing happened. which is why I say that sometimes misfortune is not the end of the story. On being placed in the slave pen in St. Bartholomew, the Masonic brother, who was a member of Africa Lodge in Boston, gave the Masonic sign of distress to a merchant who was looking over the slaves to buy them. The merchant was a Freemason, and he immediately involved himself, secured the freedom of the men who had been kidnapped, and sent them back to Boston. Now, we have in Masonic literature a number of instances where the grand all-hailing sign of distress has been made. I think of Joseph Smith before he died in prison in Carthage in Illinois. I think of the great Indian chief Bryant, who recognized the recognition of distress on a soldier he was going to kill and spared him. So we have these anecdotes of recognition. But this was confirmed, and since this was such an enormous cause célèbre, of course, the colonial newspapers took it all up and reported it. I'll quote from one of those newspapers. August 23rd, 1788, the Pennsylvania Mercury, a paper in Philadelphia. The Negroes who were kidnapped from hence last winter are returned. They were carried to St. Bartholomew's and offered for sale. One of them was a sensible fellow and a Freemason. The merchant to whom they were offered was of this fraternity. Well, you couldn't have better public relations than that. But all over the colonies, the slaves who had been scandalously kidnapped, although they were free men, have been freed. And they were freed by this strange society's recognition. And even more, it's a black lodge to which he belonged in Boston. And of course, there was much to do when they came back to Boston. Now, not all the news in these newspapers is that exciting. But what we get is all kinds of things about Prince Hall, and we need to do more investigation of his business dealings. I suppose we didn't think his business dealings were very important to Masonry. Well, this is certainly different, because now those people who felt, why was he involved with the regiment of soldiers, have a very good reason. He made their drums. Could we have the next slide, please? Out of all this, there grew this world of African American Freemasonry, in which all kinds of institutions that exist in white Freemasonry were also created. And the story is not so simple. Let's take the Duke of Sussex. There is good evidence that the Duke of Sussex, who was not very inclined to proliferate degrees, sat on a lot of institutions of which he was the primus or head, gave the African Americans commandery rights, and that the African American commanderies, Templarism, can claim Sussex origin, and so on. So what we have in America today is a system not unlike some of the systems you have seen, but of course it all goes back to the legitimacy of the Prince Hall movement. It is all sustained by the question of his lodge, the Duke of Cumberland, and what happened. But another impression we get is of what Brent and I call the dog that didn't bark. In Sherlock Holmes, brother Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has Sherlock say to his long-suffering police friend, Inspector Gregory, who is never able quite to solve the cases without Sherlock's help, about a case. The inspector says to Sherlock, "Is there anything about this case?" "Ah, yes," says Holmes. "The curious incident of the dog in the nighttime." And Inspector Gregory says, "The dog did nothing in the nighttime." And Holmes replies, "That was a curious incident." The impression one gets, looking at lodge notices, funerals, other things, is that black Freemasonry was treated equally in Boston with the other lodges, St. John's, St. Andrews, equal space, equal complaints about coverage. The dog did not bark. There was some agitation and sarcasm before the charter came, but when the charter came, we go on to another thing. Now, let us not minimize the amount of good publicity that was generated by Prince Hall. He loved a good sermon, so at the Festival of St. John, they would not hesitate to parade the church and hear a sermon. And invariably, this was publicized and even printed up. In 1792, the modern Grand Lodge in England wrote a letter to Prince Hall. And they addressed Prince Hall as Right Worshipful Prince Hall, and they asked his help. He was the only one they were hearing from. After the Revolution, people weren't talking to them, but he was sending in his dues, charity funds, and they wrote him in getting information because, quote, "We have never heard from them since the commencement of the last war in America." You see how the evidence piles up to put to rest permanently the allegation in so many Masonic authorities that Prince Hall was sort of some fiction. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence in the colonial papers of his activities. And indeed, if anybody had bothered to look, the incident of his member being sold into slavery and then rescued, everyone in America knew about that. There is also ample evidence of his Masonic literacy. I quote from a speech that Prince Hall gave in 1797 to Masons. And he said, you must always give everyone the right hand of affection and fellowship to whom it justly belongs. Let their color and complexion be what it will. His generosity. And then he said about Masons who would deny the universality of the brotherhood, let them as Masons deny this, and we and the world know what to think of them, be they ever so grand. Quite extraordinary. Could we see the next slide, please? He was, of course, one of a small minority of merchants and craftsmen who happened to be black, but who had successful lives and were not enslaved. But every day of his life, he had to live in fear that he would be kidnapped and that these all too common incidents that befell indeed a member of his lodge might befall him. And this kind of thing is hard for us to think of. Fear that be walking down on the dock, somebody would throw a blanket over you, and you would never see your family again, and you would be placed in one of these terrible ships and sold. So he did all he did despite almost inconceivable social problems that existed. The entire story of the beginnings of African American Masonry has to be set against this terrible atmosphere. Now, there are other curious things. We have a sort of festival in America called a clam bake. And essentially you go down to the seashore and you put these clams in a pit you've dug. You pile on seaweed, and then you light a fire, and you have a feast. You open the clams up, presumably wonderfully cooked, and it's just something people do, especially in the summer. Well, the Prince Hall Freemasons got to be called the modern clam eaters because they picked up this festival and they had these clam bakes and they appear in the press. And we read about them. It's a diversion, of course, from my theme, but it indicates that they quickly became part of the ethos, and that even the clam bake has something to do with Prince Hall. The only way we can understand the present American situation is to face the fact that 9 American states now will not initiate a person of color. We have an anomaly. For example, the state of West Virginia, which is adjacent to Washington, was formed during the American Civil War out of the state of Virginia because the people of West Virginia did not want slavery. Virginia fought for slavery under Robert E. Lee, but West Virginia broke off and became a separate state because it sent soldiers to die against the Confederacy in the war against slavery. In West Virginia today, a colored man cannot be a member of the West Virginia Grand Lodge and its lodges. And this lodge, like these other states, is recognized, for example, by the United Grand Lodge of England. They are well aware that in 2017, they recognize a number of Grand Lodges which will not initiate African Americans or blacks. The United Grand Lodge of England is also aware, since it holds itself out to be the beacon of regularity, that a number of American Grand Lodges, such as Tennessee and Georgia, have, now that gay people can prove that they're married, because they can get married, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee, the Grand Lodge of Georgia can prove that they're gay. Couldn't prove they were gay before they got married, but now that they are legally married, the Grand Lodge of Georgia and the Grand Lodge of Tennessee can throw them out, and have, because they're legally married and can be proven to be gay. Furthermore, we have a considerable number of people of Jewish background in Freemasonry, and they will not be initiated, as some of you know, in Scandinavian lodges or in some lodges in Germany. The Jews may not be initiated. And we have a number of higher so-called Masonic movements, Social Order of the Beauseant, the White Shrine of Jerusalem, and so on, that have no Jewish members and, of course, no black members. I might put to you, looking at this evidence, that the Masonic evidence of African American Masonic activity is more extensive than some of the evidence sustaining some of the American white Grand Lodges. And I might put to you that the Grand Lodge of England is irregular in Paul Rich's opinion, because it recognizes and has continued to recognize lodges which will not admit Jews, lodges which will not admit gays, and lodges which will not admit blacks. And I put it to you that that, in my mind, is irregularity. That is true irregularity. The Duke of Kent, in my opinion, is little more than a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan with an expensive necktie. Now, continuing this, could I have the next slide, please? Prince Hall is very much alive today. This is their lodge hall. And it's not exactly, in my thinking, a lovely building, but a lot goes on in it. It's in downtown Boston. And they're very polite about all of this that has happened. I think they're amazingly polite. Prince Hall never wavered in his protests to the newspapers about need for library and schools and all the other things. He was a citizen. And what we have seen has been what Dr. Morris and I call the manipulation of history. We quote the anthropologist Michel Roth-Trollope of how the past is silenced, how a dominant culture engages in fact creation, fact assembly, fact retrieval, and people don't look elsewhere. Now, all of this is not like I followed Captain Kidd's instructions to dig up a chest somewhere in a desert island. I simply searched the internet and found all of this evidence. Prior to this evidence, it might be excusable to allege that Prince Hall was making it up or that there wasn't much to the story. But there is so much material, so many notices. As I say, the dog did not bark. Nobody said, oh my goodness, a Black Lodge is going to march to church and hear a sermon. Just put it in, same thing. In fact, we can argue that the Black Freemasons were much more conservative than the white because they continued to pay dues to London, and they tried to communicate with London. And finally, frustrated, in 1827, a long time after the American Revolution, they published a notice in the papers that they were going to create their own organization. Long time after many of the American Grand Lodges had gone their way. This 1827 document is called their Declaration of Independence. Could I have the next slide, please? And here is their icon, preserved in eternal glass and kept in a bank vault. The Duke of Cumberland's signature in bold letters. This is the charter. Many American old lodges do not have their charters. They couldn't find them for anything. But the African American Grand Lodges have preserved this charter. Famous story, in the 19th century there was a fire, and one of the wardens crawled through the flames to get the cylinder, bring it out, to be sure they had it. And occasionally they bring it out and you can look at it. Very beautiful, very well preserved. So what is the final lesson of all this? Well, there are still stories to be investigated. There are still things to be discovered. But it seems to me that African American Freemasonry is extremely regular. In my way of thinking, it's far more regular than lodges which exclude blacks or gays or Jews. I think there is the irregularity. And I do not see how these so-called proud Grand Lodges that hold themselves out to be judges of regularity can recognize all of this so that a person of color cannot join Freemasonry, but fortunately can join Prince Hall. Thank you very much.
Merci Paul. Désolé de vous avoir un peu pressé, mais le sujet est tellement passionnant que je voulais qu'on ait un espace pour discuter. Alors, moi j'ai trouvé cette communication que j'avais eu le privilège de lire avant passionnante par son sujet. Et puis je dois dire, alors ce n'est pas très académique, que ce que je trouve extrêmement attachant et que j'admire chez Paul, c'est que pour moi, il est l'image de ce libéralisme américain, des Américains libéraux qui restent et qui essayent d'être fidèles à l'idéal d'émancipation des pères fondateurs. Et dans les temps récents, ils n'ont pas toujours été en vogue, mais vraiment, je trouve que c'est bien de tenir la barre et de rappeler tous ces idéaux qui ont pu se déployer au début de l'histoire américaine. Alors, ce que je voudrais mettre en discussion, alors d'abord réfléchissez à vos questions, c'est que sur cette question de l'initiation des gens de couleur, il y a une question qui est très compliquée, sur laquelle je n'ai pas beaucoup de lumière, mais où je sens qu'on peut en avoir, c'est, puisqu'on est en France, le rôle des gens venant de Saint-Domingue. Parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier qu'aux États-Unis, à la fin du XVIIIe siècle, il y a beaucoup de gens qui viennent de Saint-Domingue. Il y a beaucoup de blancs, bien sûr, mais il y a aussi des mulâtres et des noirs, parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier que, au sein même du camp mulâtre ou noir, il y a eu des inimitiés. Par exemple, entre les seconds de Toussaint Louverture, il y en a qui ont, par exemple, je pense au général Laplume, ou je pense à un frère dont j'ai un peu suivi l'histoire, qui est Désiré Jambon, qui a été à la fois dans le mouvement, dans l'armée noire, et puis à un moment, l'armée noire s'est divisée, a eu des interprétations différentes, et il y a un certain nombre de ces généraux noirs, ou de ces colonels noirs, qui n'ont pas pu rester à Haïti, et qui sont partis à Cuba, à la Jamaïque, en Pennsylvanie, etc. Et donc, il y a eu des maçons de couleur venant de Saint-Domingue. Alors, ce qui est très probable, c'est qu'il n'y avait probablement, avant les événements, avant la Révolution, pas de maçons noirs, pas d'esclaves ayant été initiés. En revanche, il ne faut jamais oublier le rôle très important de ce qu'on appelait les libres de couleur, c'est-à-dire des mulâtres ou des noirs d'ailleurs, qui avaient été émancipés assez tôt dans le XVIIIe siècle, qui avaient constitué un patrimoine, qui avaient souvent des esclaves d'ailleurs, eux aussi, et qui, eux, participaient à la vie sociale et qui ont pu être initiés avant les événements. Ça, c'est le premier moment où il y a pu y avoir une initiation de gens de couleur ou mulâtres. Et puis le deuxième moment, c'est quand Toussaint Louverture prend le pouvoir et prend l'ascendant sur les autres généraux noirs, et où en fait, eh bien, les loges vont recevoir des cadres du nouveau régime qui sont noirs. Et par exemple, le général Laplume, il va être initié dans une loge qui s'appelle la Réunion des cœurs franco-américains à Port-au-Prince en 1801, je crois. Et donc, lui, par exemple, et Désiré Jambon, ils vont quitter Haïti quand Dessalines prendra le pouvoir, et ils vont aller dans d'autres îles ou en Pennsylvanie. Et donc, il y a pu y avoir un échange. Ce qui serait intéressant, c'est de voir s'il y a eu un échange entre l'African Lodge et ces loges, ces frères ou mulâtres ou noirs de Saint-Domingue. Alors voilà, c'était une réflexion sur ce point-là, mais sans doute avez-vous des questions?
Oui, déjà merci beaucoup parce que c'est très éclairant de voir un petit peu toutes ces discriminations qui existent.
Et si on pouvait descendre peut-être un traducteur pour
Oui.
Paul.
Toutes ces discriminations qui existent encore aujourd'hui, que les loges refusent les noirs, les gays, c'est assez bluffant. Et je voulais poser une question sur la mixité. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, on peut imaginer, ou est-ce qu'il y a des loges qui travaillent en mixité aux États-Unis, femmes-hommes, ou pas du tout? J'imagine bien sûr que ce n'est pas des réguliers au sens Grande Loge de Londres, mais est-ce qu'on a des obédiences qui travaillent là-dessus? Et est-ce qu'il y a des combats actuels pour lutter contre ces discriminations?
So the question is, thank you very much for this lecture on discrimination and Freemasonry. And what about women? Is there debates around, is there co-Masonic lodges in US? And what is the
debate in the lodges?
and is there a debate inside the regular Masonry
yeah.
about sorry.
Well, of course, there are many American Masons who are absolutely furious about things like the Grand Lodge of Tennessee and the Grand Lodge of Georgia throwing out members because they got married. And there are, I think, a majority of American Masons feel that their leadership has let them down, that it has not responded to an obvious problem. This is 2017. Now, when I say this is 2017, I think that means it's about time. I cannot excuse these things. I cannot excuse these things. And in particular, I cannot excuse recognition of the people who do these things. Now, a problem has always been the lack of recognition of the Grand Orient. Grand Orient is far more Masonic than the Grand Lodge of England, in my opinion. In my opinion, the Grand Lodge of England and many American Grand Lodges are bureaucracies which have missed entirely the idea of Masonry. Masonry is a child of the Enlightenment. It's about diversity. So the answer to your question is yes, there are a great many people who find it abhorrent that this is going on. But I find it very hypocritical to talk about this wonderful movement that is bringing such good things when it is the most segregated major organization in America. It is the most segregated organization in America.
And about women.
Right?
And about women. Women in regular Masonry. What is your opinion?
Also, bringing up the question of women, women have always been Freemasons. I have the honor to be a Freeman of the City of London. Great honor. And as a Freeman of the City of London, I can tell you that in the ancient guilds, there were women in the records. And we have today this terribly distinguished scholar of the companionage, and the companionage always has depended on women running its houses. Again, I will repeat, it is 2017, and an organization which refuses to admit women is going to die. And nobody will be at the funeral. It is, I cannot, as a teacher, go in the classroom and have young women or young men think that I am a leader in an organization which would not have them because they happen to be women, or they happen to be gay, or they happen to be Jews, or they happen to be colored. It compromises you as a teacher. They think, what's he like, if he belongs to things like that. So I think that we're long overdue having women in. I do not object to having male lodges, female lodges, and joint lodges if people wish to have them. But the thing is that they must wish to have them, and it must be voluntary and not imposed by edicts and canons and grand masters.
Jacques? Pardon, vas-y, Cécile. Vas-y.
Right. Well, I'm so happy to hear what I just heard, Paul, especially on women. But I mean, I knew what you were thinking already about the Grand Lodge of Tennessee, the Grand Lodge of Georgia, and that was very brave of you. And of a few American Masons actually reacted very violently on their blogs to condemn such stances. Now, it's true that women are not very often discussed, are they? But, well, I mean, I was very happy to hear you, and I must admit that when I went to California, for the first time, I was allowed to speak not only as a scholar, but also as a member of the Grand Orient de France. And this is something that was totally new, right? And that was at the end of the session. Okay, and now to go back on what Pierre was saying, about Prince Hall Freemasonry, and I actually found, in one of his discourses, I think it's the speeches, the 1797 speech, he actually, Prince Hall, mentions Haiti, and he actually gives Haiti as an example of a successful revolution and of emancipation for black people. But I'm not sure, though. I have never found in my own, researches evidence that there were a lot of people coming from Haiti and then joining the Prince Hall lodges. But then, the Prince Hall lodges really developed at the end of the 19th century. Before that, They were really few and far between. Alors, je parlais en anglais, excusez-moi, c'était pour Paul, mais je pense que ça a été traduit ou il y a eu... Ça va? Bon, ok.
Oui, c'est-
About 20 years ago, we had a big fight in Washington because our clubs, our gentlemen's clubs, would not have women in them. And if you came to one of the clubs, like the University Club or the Metropolitan Club, and you were a woman, they had a little back door. You come in the back door, and they had a little room you could sit in. And, so the women said, okay, I'm a woman lawyer, and I'm at a disadvantage. I can't take my clients to the club. Now, you use the fireman. My taxes pay for the fireman. You use the police. My taxes as a woman pay for the police. You use the snow clearing and the road maintenance, and my taxes pay for that. Okay, if you're not going to let women in, we're not going to plow your snow, we're not going to put out your fire, and we're not going to police you. Well, we had meetings, and we had people who did not want women in their clubs. Well, I'm proud to say that these clubs not only have women and people of color, but people of color and women have been presidents of these clubs. And the clubs are doing just fine.
Thanks very much for your brilliant presentation. You did mention the name of Albert Pike. Does he still have some influence in America today? Albert Pike.
Oui.
You did mention Albert Pike as a racist. You remember?
What is Albert Pike considered as a racist today? Albert Pike, a racist? Pike, you know, Albert Pike.
I don't understand.
Yeah, no, Albert Pike, you know Pike, so Scottish Rite Grand Commander.
Yes, that's right.
Is he considered today again as a racist?
Oh. Well, of course the Scottish Rite is racist because you can't join the Scottish Rite unless you join a Blue Lodge. So if I'm in West Virginia, I can't join a regular Blue Lodge, so I can never be a member of the Scottish Rite. Then the Scottish Rite puts on a little dance. We would take you if you could join the Caucasian White Grand Lodge, which is ridiculous. So in those 9 states, there are no black members because they can't join a 3rd degree lodge, which would make them eligible for the Scottish Rite or the York Rite. So it's nonsense to say it's not. The Scottish Rite is segregationist.
He wrote many, many books about the Scottish Rite, and my question was to ask you whether there is still an influence of Albert Pike as a writer on the Scottish Rite. Am I clear?
Well, you know, there has been a great debate over Albert Pike. He was a Civil War general on the Confederate side. His Indians took scalps of Union troops. He is certainly a character. Very Southern. His spirit is still alive. He owned slaves. He was a great friend of the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, General Forrest. But you have to be careful. On the other hand, he gave his rituals to a number of black leaders, gave them. So he's like all of us, a bit schizophrenic. And of course, you can't judge people by today. I don't know what Jesus Christ would have thought about parking meters. Does anybody here know what Jesus Christ would have said about parking meters? I don't know what Jesus Christ would say about parking meters, and I don't know what Albert Pike would be doing today. But he was certainly a strange person.
Alors, souvent, les personnages sont ambigus, c'est vrai.
Good day, Eric, and thank you for the lecture. You keep on mentioning the Swedish Rite or the Scandinavian countries, because to join them you need to be Christian. There is some misunderstanding. There is a mutual visiting right, so even you're not Christian, if you are a recognized Freemason, you have a visiting right and you can visit the lodges. I don't know for the other Scandinavian country. I come from Iceland, and I'm a master of our lodge, and the petition form has been changed, so it is not required anymore a signature of your wife. It is a signature of a partner. So I can initiate into my lodge homosexual and colored people, but they need to be Christian because the rite is Christian rite, and it has no meaning for you to join the lodge if you're not Christian. It's similar that I cannot join a French lodge because I don't understand a word in French. And we are not discriminating anything. There exists and still exists a Masonry club that was under the Grand Lodge of Iceland in the US NATO base in Keflavik, where colored people from America, white people and Icelanders met in brotherhood. Thank you.
Thank you. He says that in Iceland you can be black people and homosexuals, but they only ask for Christianity because the rite is Christian, so it has no meaning if you are not Christians. Thank you for this testimony. Alors, on va arriver à la fin de nos échanges, mais vous avez vu que ça a suscité beaucoup de débats. Ce qu'on peut peut-être faire dans une approche un peu comparatiste, c'est évoquer les recherches que nous avons faites, nous, sur la franc-maçonnerie française. Et par exemple, quand on a fait la plaquette là, sur les 240 ans du Grand Orient, on a publié ce débat très intéressant de 1784 à propos de ce commerçant algérien qui s'était vu refuser l'entrée de la loge de Nantes sous prétexte qu'il était musulman. Et il y a un texte très beau de la Chambre d'administration du Grand Orient qui explique que la franc-maçonnerie n'étant pas de nature religieuse, il n'y a aucune raison de le refuser. Alors ça c'est un exemple intéressant. Et puis il y a bien sûr la question de Saint-Domingue. Et je dirais que la question de Saint-Domingue, elle est un peu comme la question de Pâques, elle est complexe. C'est-à-dire que naturellement, quand on est à Saint-Domingue au XVIIIe siècle, il y a un élément de discrimination, c'est bien évident. Mais en même temps, dans des contextes particuliers, on voit des éléments de fraternisation. Et donc, il faut essayer de suivre un peu ce processus complexe qui va amener à la modernité. D'autres réflexions? Oui, monsieur Ali, pardon, excusez-moi.
Merci pour cet excellent exposé qui ô combien éclairant. L'orateur nous a dit que Prince Hall était libre et voilà, qui n'a jamais été esclave. Est-ce qu'il peut nous expliquer pourquoi un noir aux États-Unis était libre? Voilà.
How could Prince Hall be a free man and never been a slave? Because his father has been emancipated, I suppose.
Well, of course, there are several ways at that time people became free. They could become free by purchase. Some of the skilled craftsmen had been able to buy their freedom from their masters. They could become free by the fact of being born in or being transported to those countries which did not tolerate slavery. In British possessions, there was a process called manumission, where in some of the colonial possessions, there was a flagpole within the grounds of the British legation, and if a slave could embrace the flagpole, he would be manumitted or freed. That's a custom. So there are a large number of ways in which a person could become free. Many of the black people who became free were the product of mixed marriages, where their father had been white and their mother black, or vice versa, and they were freed by the will when the person died. When someone died, like Thomas Jefferson, he freed some of his slaves in his last will and testimony. So there are a whole variety of ways in which people became free, but they had to be very careful because of the slavers who would not hesitate to kidnap them.
Alors, moi, je voudrais ajouter que, à l'exemple de ce qu'a fait Paul pour Prince Hall, nous, on a vraiment tout un travail à faire sur Saint-Domingue. Alors, effectivement, que des maçons de couleur de Saint-Domingue et à partir de Prince Hall, on ne le sait pas, mais il y en a très probablement qui sont venus aux États-Unis, alors moins d'ailleurs à Boston ou à New York qu'en Louisiane, où en Louisiane, vous savez qu'il y a 10 000 ex de Saint-Domingue, alors j'allais dire blancs de Saint-Domingue, mais ils n'étaient pas tous blancs, 10 000 anciens de Saint-Domingue qui vont s'installer en Louisiane entre 1806 et 1810. Et comme par hasard, aux États-Unis, c'est en Louisiane qu'on va voir les premiers maçons de couleur avec l'affaire du Suprême Conseil de la Nouvelle-Orléans. Et donc là, il y a probablement un gisement à trouver. En même temps, c'est une question compliquée et je vais revenir au colonel Désiré Jambon qui a suscité ma sympathie, que j'ai découvert par hasard, qui est donc un maçon qu'on retrouve à Porto Rico au Grand Orient dans les années 1810, 1820, 1830. Et on connaît son existence parce que ses frères écrivent au Grand Orient à sa mort en 1830 pour dire à quel point c'était un homme exceptionnel, etc., etc. Et alors, donc, quand on commence à chercher qui c'était, on tombe sur sa carrière militaire, et c'est donc un des seconds de la plume, donc un des seconds de Toussaint Louverture. Et puis, en fait, lui et un certain nombre de ses amis vont s'opposer à Dessalines et donc ne pourront pas rester à Haïti, donc ils partent. Alors en même temps, je ne veux pas dire que ce sont des harkis, mais du coup l'histoire officielle d'Haïti les regarde avec une certaine méfiance. Et alors dans mes investigations, je trouve à un moment que l'ex-colonel Désiré Jambon était lui-même possesseur d'esclaves, etc., etc. Je me dis zut, etc. Puis en grattant un peu, en cherchant, etc., il était censé avoir un esclave. Je pense que c'était un vieil ami qui devait accompagner, etc. Mais enfin, de là aux riches possesseurs d'une plantation avec des centaines d'esclaves, etc. Mais donc, c'est une histoire très difficile de faire l'histoire des mulâtres et des gens de couleur maçons à Saint-Domingue à la fin du XVIIIe et au début du XIXe siècle. Mais je crois que c'est un vrai enjeu. C'est un vrai enjeu et on trouve des choses quand on gratte un peu. Donc, il faut continuer dans cette voie. En tout cas, je vois que ça vous a passionné. Moi, j'ai vraiment été passionné par cette étude de Paul, à la fois par le sujet lui-même, et puis on découvre à quel point Prince Hall était un personnage extraordinaire, et puis par la méthode mise en œuvre. Ça, c'est une recherche qui était impossible avant les nouvelles techniques digitales. Donc, une approche académique classique ouvre là un nouveau champ. Merci bien. Alors, je crois que nous devons décerner un award now. No? We should deliver an award now.
We just recognize Alan.
Okay.
I
So,
think
should we do it now or after the...
I think we should just do it now.
Okay.
We all know that Alan is a great scholar, and we're all very sorry he's so sick. I think that's
Donc, vous savez que, comme je l'ai expliqué ce matin, la conférence délivre 3 prix. Donc, nous avons délivré le prix Bartholdi ce matin à la revue d'études sur la maçonnerie latino-américaine et caraïbe, qui depuis une dizaine d'années fait un travail extraordinaire et dont je répète que pour ceux qui ne la connaissent pas, vous pouvez regarder leur site internet. Vous faites Revista, Masonica, Latino-America, et donc sur le site internet, il y a tous les anciens numéros en PDF. Et donc, nous délivrons maintenant le Regulus Award. Donc, je laisse Paul procéder.
I hope this will give him some cheer in his illness, and we're going to see that he gets the film of the proceedings, of course. He has written a couple books that we have published, and like everything he has ever done meticulously and with great scholarship. So our prayers go with him, and I'm sure when I call him tonight, he'll be very happy that you were here and that we send him our very best for his recovery.
Voilà, chers amis, vous avez maintenant une pause avant la reprise des travaux d'ici, théoriquement, une dizaine de minutes, donc peut-être un quart d'heure.
Well, how did you think that went?
Sorry.
How do you think it went?
Yeah, it was very interesting. They were very, of course, very captivated by the